Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place, especially if you're looking forward to watching me die, since I recently dove into Item 42's first-person action roguelite Parish. There's some quirks to the genre here, but we'll get more on that later, because ultimately I'm going to be doing my best to answer the question of whether this Orphic Odyssey was inspired, or if Parish's perils and pitfalls left me peeved. I'm your host, Arlyeon. Let's find out together. The Orphic rituals, Hellenistic teachings that promised a path to the Elysium fields, if you'd undertaken them in life. That said, for those sorry souls who rejected those rites, the Ametri, only purgatory awaits. An endless gauntlet of suffering which tasks them to follow a similar path as Orpheus once had in his escape from Hades' chthonic halls. Perhaps, with the guidance of the mysterious priestess, you might touch upon the heart of those neglected rites, and convince King Minos to look upon your passage fondly. Though, perhaps, you may find yourself led astray by the promise of Danake, the underworld's bloody currency. All in all, the game doesn't waste too much time in introducing you to its premise, with the priestess NPC providing you just enough information to get you started on your journey. From there, you'll receive the occasional bit of lore as you progress further through the underworld, providing a bit of context about both the area and your current objective, which I should mention, it's nice that they fleshed this out given that each area has a pool of activities to complete. That said, the real meat of the world building comes from the collectibles, whether it's the large stone steles or the hidden objects, each of which provide details about the locations, the enemies, and just small little elements of the world itself, all of which is easily accessible in your codex. In fact, it's through these details, as well as a particular NPC in the hub, that you'll be able to begin unearthing the path towards the best ending. Though that route will require more than just a collectible hunt. It will set you on a collision course with the absolute hardest challenge this game has to offer in order to see that ending. And that's saying something given just how vicious this game is. Which, let's get into that. So, Parish is a title which prides itself on difficulty, to the point that your initial loadout is a broken sword in a pathetic health pool that empties in 3 hits. Really, it's a bit sadistic, especially once you factor in the whole you'll find yourself constantly harried by endless enemy spawns. That said, it's more than simply a matter of toughness which serves to provide this particular roguelite its identity. For one thing, it actually omits a rather notable element of the genre, as Parish favors handcrafted stages, which you're tasked with traversing in an altogether linear fashion. Well, mostly linear, since there is a random element to be found in the objective system, as the goals you need to achieve in order to move on from the current stage will be pulled from a potential pool, albeit one tailored to that specific area. That said, if you're hoping for that sort of variety throughout the entirety of the game, you can expect to be a bit disappointed, since the further you progress in, the fewer variants each area will have, which is a bit funny since the further you get in, the lengthier each stage becomes. It's a bit of an odd mix, and one that wound up making the endgame segments feel a bit tedious ultimately, as the pace found itself bogged down by harried hikes to the afterlife. Which is a bit of a problem since Parish already has some pacing issues, in large part because of certain objectives it loves to implement. See, while I say they pull from a variety, the fact of the matter is this game really enjoys giving you hold the point quests, or accompany the payload. Sure, there's some fun things like slaying a minotaur, and then if you're in co-op, getting hit with a minotaur ambush. Things like that are neat, as is the fact that they take into account the addition of other players. That said, having to sit in a spot running in circles as an endless swarm of enemies runs at you or spams ranged attacks at you, and doing this repeatedly over the course of several stages isn't anywhere near as engaging. Nor is having to hold down a button in order to channel loading an object while being attacked. That one in particular was absolutely obnoxious until I realized you can actually block while doing so. But even then, it didn't address the core of it, especially when you factor in the way that co-op makes these segments work. See, not only does co-op add additional points that you will need to hold down, all the players need to actually be present inside the objective point or no progress is made, and while that might not sound so bad, quite a few of these crop up in horrid locations and or grow smaller the longer you defend it, forcing you to crowd up against each other or against objects you can get stuck on. And sure, blocking might be somewhat viable as a way to stall things out, but that only works if you can block. Which, right, so weapons. Initially, the game's essentially a very minimalist hack and slash. You have your broke-ass sword, which lets you block, a kick that can knock over smaller enemies and into environmental obstacles, some throwing knives, and some very basic consumable firebombs. That said, it won't be long until you begin to find alternate weapons. Some of them will be acquired from chests in the levels, or from advancing past a boss, or even clearing an optional objective. All of them will require you to spend gold to unlock them as a form of permanent progress, but there's an odd quirk to them. See, you can only bring one weapon with you, effectively locking you in as either playing the game as a first-person hack and slash or as a first-person shooter, since, well, there's a lot of guns despite the whole mythological element here, and I do mean guns. And while these are certainly powerful offensively, their damage output comes at a price, namely the almost complete loss of defensive options since you can't block with them. So remember that whole thing about getting boxed in and slowly shrinking defensive points during co-op? Or fiddling with interactables? Yeah, that gets painful. Like, yes, you still do have a dash as part of your kit with either style of weapons, but the cooldown on it doesn't feel that great, especially since the game will already ask you to use it as a common means of traversal in later stages, even as enemies shoot predictive lightning bolts where you're going or scour the area with heat lasers. Which means in single player, you'll either find yourself relying on the consumable item that gives you brief invincibility, if you unlocked it included in your kit, or you'll be forced to loop around in circles, making only the slightest progress as the game continuously spawns enemies in your immediate vicinity as well as your blind spots. It legitimately feels bad. Alright, okay, wait. This is Arlyeon from the future speaking because there was a patch. While you still do have to deal with ceaseless spawns, the devs actually listened to the community here and made it so enemies can no longer pop up directly beside you, and highly limited their capacity to pop into existence behind you, which helps immensely with people intent on soloing the game. You're a lot less likely to earn yourself a nice quick sear on your back while you're trying to make progress, and this is also pretty darn promising insofar as addressing a major issue. Anyways, back to the review. Still, as much as ranged weapons do have these flaws, they also make handling a number of the bosses a lot more viable, especially the third act boss, which continuously swivels to face you, a quirk that makes it incredibly tedious to hit its weak spot with a melee weapon, and even complicates the precision required to throw daggers at it, especially as it spams waves of soon-to-be crab rangoon at you. Pick your poison, I guess. Still, as much as I chafed at the singular weapon thing, especially whenever the game would force me to pick up a stick for an objective, there are elements I enjoy about them. First off, all of the weapons feel quite distinct from each other, with a different heft to their attacks, attack ranges, damage speed, and even effects. Admittedly, the latter elements take a bit of work since each weapon has a pair of challenges associated with them, one of which unlocks a passive ability like causing explosions on headshots with a pistol or waves of fire on a swing from the hammer, as well as active abilities like shooting frickin' lasers or summoning meteors. That's also the hammer. The hammer is just really awesome, honestly. I was going to say don't use shotguns, but they actually got patched recently, so they do a bit more damage and also aren't quite as spread, so you'll have a lot more trouble missing someone point blank. I'm still a little bit iffy about using them, but yeah, no, they were at least patched, so the odds of you putting it directly in front of someone's face, pulling the trigger, and seeing nothing isn't going to be quite as much of a frequent occurrence. That's not even the crux of all your options either. There's other bits of permanent character customization you get access to. Like I mentioned earlier, you get custom items, which can provide a wide range of support options for active use and, more importantly, crowns and rings. These latter elements are especially important since they essentially grant you passive boosts, like better and more throwable daggers, extra health up to potentially double your base, and even shortcuts to latter levels. With 1 crown slot and 6 rings, you can ultimately set up a number of build options, some of which were highly complementary when playing with other people. Admittedly, Parish still finds a way to troll you on this front too, albeit a bit more subtly. So, to give some context, when you finish a stage, you wind up in an airlock, a nice stone chamber with a chest, a priestess statue to advance, and a healing fountain that restores a single point of healing, which actually feels incredibly significant with how fragile you are. There's also a scoreboard if you feel the need to be competitive with your friends, like proving how much better I am than hop instead of jump. But yeah, it's also your only real safe spot in the entire game, since even in single player, you can't actually pause. Something I found out to my chagrin when Batsfine came over to ask me a question, and I proceeded to eat shit like a chump because despite hitting escape and toggling a menu, it did absolutely nothing for me. Anyways, the galling element here is that chest I mentioned, since it provides you the option to change your weapon in case it's not working for you, or if you finished its challenge and you want to try a new one, or your crown, in the case that you might have used one to go and get a shortcut and now you actually want something that gives you a relevant ability. Or you can even replace and replenish your consumables. This all sounds nice until you realize that every item you unlock increases the potential pool of items it has to pull from. And once you've acquired enough consumables, the viability of actually replenishing an item you want to use tanks in favor of it potentially offering you some garbage options. Oh, and you can only pick one option before the chest closes. Yes, enemies do have a small chance of dropping consumables when killed, as does destroying destructibles in the wild, but it's not necessarily a high chance, which means if you're not feeling confident, it's sometimes best to cut your losses and leave through the exit portal, even despite how lengthy a run can be, in large part because there's also a doozy of a death penalty. See, all those shiny toys you want to buy, those cost Danake, which you're slowly accruing from clearing objectives and killing bad guys. But if you die rather than leave, you lose something like 70% of it, which is incredibly painful, especially with how expensive some of the later items are. That's not to say it's entirely unmitigatable. For instance, every time you clear a stage, you gain access to a selection of run-specific perks. While these can have awesome effects like causing your daggers to explode on hit, and I will always recommend you take that one, or disabling your ability to heal with fountains in exchange for letting you heal from mass murder, or even killing people by looking at them, it also rarely provides you more lucre-oriented luxuries, like banking all the money you've currently earned because you want to keep pushing onwards, but don't want to lose the money. That, or the 3 cards the current stage offered you, and that was the best of some bad options. Because yes, it's really nice to get 50% more money, but at the same time, when that comes at the cost of even more enemies harass you, there's a little bit of a squinty eye that you might want to go and apply to that choice of card. Still, I shouldn't judge it too harshly, since sometimes death feels unavoidable. More than a few times I've found my movement controls would lock up after I cleared the final objective of a stage and finished picking my perk, and I would just simply stop dead in my tracks, and the game would take a moment to register me moving in a direction, sometimes leading to enemies landing a free hit, or 2. And this was in single player, by the way, because in multiplayer you do have to wait for everyone to pick, but there should be no excuse for this in single player. Or I'd get stuck on an awkward texture, potentially after I dashed. Times like those did leave me wishing I'd snagged that card. And frankly, I can't count the amount of Danaki I lost when I finally hunkered down and began to scour the various stages for the secrets I'd missed. Because if you can set aside the game's constant flow of enemies, there's actually some well-hidden and even clever secrets to seek out, with some of them even tied to the objective-specific routes just to keep you on your toes. Though, I think of all the secrets I encountered, the Orphic Rites were my favorite. Now, in and of themselves, the Orphic Rites start out simple, essentially being a set of optional challenges you can purchase in the hub and toggle on as something extra to do during runs in order to unlock extra equipment. That said, when you reach the bottom of each line, you're provided a small riddle, which is in turn hinted at in the collectible Orphic tablets, providing you one final set of puzzles. It's honestly pretty neat, and it does give you some really great toys to play with, unless you decide to undertake the true Orphic ending, because that essentially puts you on a collision course with suffering. Whilst I won't say too much on it, I will say that it essentially strips away all of the niceties that you earned over the course of the game, and essentially tasks you with getting good. What's more, if you're playing co-op, you'll need to get your partner on board with you as well, since if they fail to adhere to everything you need to do for the good ending, it'll screw you over as well. And here's the thing, doing this solo is agonizing. On one hand, there are elements of doing so that I enjoy. It essentially forced me to learn the mechanics to a T, to master blocking and mobility, as well as to figure out how to bestest bosses and which perks to pick for an optimal journey. And I enjoy its boss encounters to a substantial degree, with the final boss encounter sticking out as a pretty excellent climatic encounter. But the third boss is both literally and figuratively cancer. He was my wall for solo Orphic runs. I state this because I did finally beat this asshole, but it took a while, and I despise him with a passion. But I suppose I'll quit being crabby and shell out the goods on the graphics. While there were some segments that felt a bit dark by default, the stages and enemies are fun to look at as you tromp through them. Yes, it does feel like a bit of a luxury to get the time to take in the sights, but when you can, such as while your partner is busy getting mauled, there's certainly elements to appreciate, or just to stare at in horrified awe, like when you reach the second phase of the Deimos and Phobos boss fight. And on a less pressing note, there's fashion to find, courtesy of certain well-hidden lore collectibles. With a bit of snooping, you can acquire such fine options like turning into a lizard person, or embracing the cancer and just becoming a crab, perfect for unsettling strangers in co-op or gaining a new set of arms and legs to ogle while you're just hanging out on your own. So, that said, as neat as those features are, the aesthetic element that I really have to praise is the audio. Because, my god, once again we have a game chock full of bangers. It provides such a solid array of tunes for its various regions, sometimes several tracks even for one stage, and I would honestly be hard-pressed to think of one I didn't like. Oh, and there's voice acting, and it is quite good. That's it. The audio is just fantastic in this. That's the long of things, so let's get into the short. And what I ultimately have to say about Parish is, well, it's a bit of a rough ride. Story-wise, I'm actually quite fond of it, as it does a decent job of fleshing out its world without just dumping exposition on you, and what is present feels relevant to your journey and also hints at the path you'll ultimately need to take, and just snooping around to go and discover things wound up feeling satisfying in the long run. As for the mechanical, it is a bit of a rough start. Adjusting to the game and the quirks of how to deal with some of its objectives, the sheer length of certain stages, the limited weapon carrying system punishing you for making a decision, and just other elements like the sheer resource loss as you try and make progress ultimately feels quite bad initially. In fact, the part that really sunk all this home for me was the overarching sensation of tedium as I progressed forward. Frequently killing enemies can feel absolutely pointless during wave segments, as opposed to just running away, especially when their replacements cropped up almost immediately when I did bother to ventilate their skulls. In absolutely heinous detail, by the way, in levels focused around laser-firing furies, though again, I am grateful that they no longer pop in behind me with their obligatory tanning services. And While the objective system did help to break up some of the monotony of revisiting the same areas, ultimately the limited pool will see you becoming incredibly familiar with the same few outcomes in the same few stages, especially given the latter elements replace variety with sheer length. Sure, as I gained more weapons and items to boost my survivability and got more options in how to confront the levels, I got the means to explore the stages in some semblance of peace and even engage in bonus objectives like weapon upgrading and Orphic rites in a somewhat more accessible manner. A detail which I should note is actually a bit more accessible now because there was a recent change to spawns before and after objectives, allowing a little bit more breathing room, but you are still going to be endlessly attacked. Still, it took a fair bit to reach that point, and the journey itself doesn't necessarily feel intuitive. Nor did the fact that playing in single player was ultimately less of a headache. There's definitely something about the coordination element that really left something to be desired for me, especially when it dawned on me that while the true ending would at least be a bit easier in the boss segments in co-op, a single mistake in an airlock could ruin an hour and chain's worth of work. Likely more than that really, given how co-op influences the overall objective length and time you spend in each stage. So, at the end of the day, Parish is a tricky work to judge, because to some degree it is working as intended. This is a game that sneaks its difficulty option in its menu and starts you off on the hardest difficulty. It is very much something that ascribes to the ethos of killing the player dead repeatedly and teaching them through misery and hardship to get good. And simultaneously, it does provide you with interesting tools to overcome those challenges, both initially and especially as you delve deeper into its guts. That said, there's just so much repetition which slowly eroded at the parts of the game that I liked, and which gradually began to work at the relatively limited pool of things to do, which overall pervaded my experience. Admittedly, because of the recent quick patches, I do have a fair bit more hope that these rougher edges will get ironed out, but even still, I feel that this game is a fumble. One that is in a better place than it was before, and which I am admittedly fond of in a weird masochistic manner, but it is a fumble all the same, something that I would find a bit difficult to recommend to someone unless this is the specific genre of game that you feel you would mesh with, because it very happily wants you to die. Also, to Parish's credit, I do actually think it wraps things up in a fairly satisfactory manner in its narrative fashion, both for the bad ending and the good ending. Still, and I do feel the need to emphasize this again, there are issues still that sapped a bit of that enjoyment, which ultimately detracted from the multiplayer experience to a substantial degree. Also, the co-op kept bugging out on me. Like, I swear to God, this just seemed to be a reoccurring thing, though at least in this case, resetting the client would fix it until it happens again. It should be fine. I believe they're actually working on another patch for this. There was something announced for it. I was just playing the single player though after this point because it just was the only way I could make decent progress. But yeah. Thanks for tuning in! If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For the Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the video description, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on indie games live. And before I actually do my outro, if you have stayed here this long, I'm going to be releasing something a little bit special because I really hate channels that go and do things like, oh, we have the true ending here and the secret ending, and they don't. They just have one ending. So at some point, probably within a week, I'm going to put the secret / true ending / good ending on my channel, albeit with a spoiler warning. So yeah, no, I'm just doing this because I'm very petty. That's it. That's all. Just, if you're gonna say that your video is that, actually have your video be that. I don't want to be the one who has to, like, put the true ending on the internet because you can't fucking do your job. I'm done. Yeah, thanks folks. I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then!